Good evening, everyone. I'm pleased to see such a great number for today's lecture. It is my immense pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Camilla Pietravista. Camilla received her PhD from the Courtauld in 2019 on the subject of Rococo landscapes 1680-1750. Currently, Camilla is a postdoctoral fellow in the history of art at the University of Venice. And while in that position, she's reworking her dissertation, transforming it into a book to be published under the title Rococo Landscapes, Suburban Nature and Artist Mobility in 18th Century Paris. She's the author of Disegni di natura urbana, l'immagine dei dintorni di Parigi nel primo Settecento, published in 2021, which resulted from her fellowship at the Fondazione 1563 for Art and Culture based in Turin. Camilla's interests include the visual culture of prints and drawings in the long 18th century and the representation of landscape in early modern Europe, particularly in relation to urban transformation and the politics of nature. Her essays have been published in 18th siècle, Studiolo, and the Burlington magazine. Currently, Camilla is organizing an international conference on landscape drawing in the making, materiality, practice, experience, 1500 to 1800, which will take place in Venice in March 24 at the Fondazione Giorgio Cini. And if you happen to be there then, or if you can't travel there, I highly recommend you to come and listen to the many papers that Camilla and her colleague have selected. Tonight's lecture is on Venetian waterscapes, Veduta drawings, and the 18th century. And let's welcome Camilla's.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I wish to warmly thank Katie Gottardo for this invitation and you all. This was an intense day, a long day for all of us, and so I thank you in advance for your efforts and your attention. The Grand Canal, as a waterway which orientates Venetian visual culture, has been represented in various media, from drawing and painting to film and photography. A special place is occupied by early film. One of the earliest tracking shots in the history of cinema, taken by cameraman Alexandre Prognot for the Lumière Company, was filmed in Venice in 1896. It consisted of a sequence taken from a boat traveling north along the Grand Canal. The fluid scan of buildings facing the water on the canal's west side, interrupted by silhouettes of gondoliers and the passage of the public vaporetto, and as the boat approached the Rialto Bridge, the city's geographic and commercial center. Like all the early films by the Lumière Company, it lasts less than 50 seconds, just enough time to capture the most notable elements of this urban route, such as the palace's magnificent facades, originally designed to be admired from the water. However short, Prognot's films, entitled Panorama, with reference to a pre-cinematic device invented at the end of the 18th century, engages the viewer to experience Venice from its main waterway. Like the 19th century panorama, the tracking shot offered the illusion of immersion into urban space, but unlike the panorama, it attempted to reproduce the perceptive sensation of movement through a sequence of images or frames. The topographic view, or Veduta, has a special place in the history of the various attempts to visualize the continual experience of the world, which would converge in the cinematic image. 18th century vedute were represented on popular prints used in a number of devices such as the so-called Mondo Nuovo. The term, introduced by author Carlo Goldoni, referred to the new and exotic images to be seen in peep shows, also called cosmorama or pantoscope. The street hawkers selling images and running the show are epitomized by the man operating his box in a print from the 1753 series by Gaetano Zompini of The Cries of Venice. The three-line verse below the image advertises that by looking inside the box, the little boy could admire distant views and perspectives, lontananze e prospettive. The features used to enhance the illusionistic and immersive effects included lenses to enlarge the view, mirrors to add spatial depth, and the bull's eye windows and open lantern perched above the box used to manipulate light, as seen, for example, in this other painting now in the National Museum of Cinema in Torino. More importantly for us, as we see again at the back of Pietro Longhi's street scene, a series of fissures on the side of the box made the prints movable by means of strings. Cutouts of prints functioned as stage settings which remained fixed, while other background images changed, sliding in and out of view. Thus, the effect of movement carried away the spectator into the depicted cityscapes, often faraway places. Cinema historian Tom Gunning has demonstrated that early cinema was less a way of telling stories than a way of presenting a series of views to an audience, since the majority of the earliest moving films were travelogues developed from the photographic slides. What Gunning calls a cinema of attractions, which dominated the new art of motion pictures until the success of narrative forms of filmmaking around 1906, was predicated on the ability to simply show something, often a faraway land. In short, early cinema established what he describes as the harnessing of visibility itself. From the perspective of media archaeology, this non-narrative aesthetic is associated with the simultaneous development of numerous optical devices from the mid-18th century to the end of the 19th century, and the production of topographic views in prints and drawings. In the Venice region, the publishing firm Remondini in Bassano del Grappa specialized in popular prints and established a far-reaching European network of traveling colporteurs who sold them to other street vendors or to the public. Most often, these prints depicted the city's most important landmarks through deep perspectival recession, accentuated by the strong shadows cast by buildings in the foreground. The viewpoint, slightly elevated, ensures good visibility of the urban fabric and the figures animating the scene. Although they were conceived in series, these images did not construct topographical sequences. The focus on landmarks enabled the discovery of different faraway cities in just a short time. They stimulated spectators to look into many directions within the image, the eye moving diagonally towards the different porticos, archways, and bridges that touched the depicted space. Although during the show these pictures were physically put in motion, the images were not meant to create spatial narratives, since, as argued by Gunning, the visibility of significant sites was an end in itself. These shows, which began touring northern Italy at the turn of the century, reached their popularity in the 1740s. The album, published under the title Prospectus Magni Canalis Venetiarum in 1735, marks a pivotal moment in this genealogy of media. The 12 views Canaletto had painted for his patron and exclusive dealer Joseph Smith were etched by Antonio Visentini and arranged as a coherent sequence of the Grand Canal, powerfully creating the feeling of simulated travel. The prospectus topographical itinerary pivots around the Rialto Bridge, with views 1 to 7 going east from Rialto to Punta della Dogana. I mean, the numbers are very small, but perhaps as I guide you, you can understand and follow. And views 7 to 12 moving west towards the Canal Regio and Santa Clara. The novelty of this selection and arrangement in the Venetian context can be gauged from the words of Francis Haskell, who in Patrons and Painters observed that, I quote, "the views were chosen not because of the interest, importance, or beauty of the objects to be represented, but purely so as to achieve a documentary record of the whole Grand Canal. Up and down, very systematically, the painter has worked his way through this great artery, leaving as fine and yet as unpretentious a memorial as any city has ever had. Such an attitude to art is quite new," end quote. The key term here is unpretentious. Haskell observes that the prospectus is a tribute to the city as it is, creating a documentary view of everyday life, which, as a result, highlights the unique splendor of the urban fabric. The addition of two views, number 13 and 14 in brown on this map, depicting two civic festivities, may seem to contradict this argument. Yet, both events connect the city to its environmental condition and territoriality founded on water. One on the left, you see the regatta, a nautical competition observed near Rialto, and on the right, the feast day of the Ascension with the Bucintoro, or the Doge's gondola, sailing in San Marcos Bay. The prospectus second edition, on which we will come back in a moment, was issued in 1742 and made this mechanism even stronger by proposing a sequence of 12 views moving from the west entrance at Santa Clara to San Marco. And the two final views of the piazzetta and dock together work as does a reverse shot in a film dialogue, while other views can be considered as pairings because they generate a sense of continuity, showing contiguous sections of the canal from the same building. For example, here on the right, in the right image, and on the left, in the left image, you have probably what I think is Palazzo Emo, fragments of which are seen in both. Together, these different techniques encouraged the mental reconstruction of urban space into a continuous viewing sequence, associating the territorial condition of the city built on water with the experience of virtual movement. This evening, I explore the visual culture of spectacle in 18th century Venice through Canaletto's drawings. In the first part, I will argue that the artist conceived works on paper as independent from his painted oeuvre and discuss the serial logic which underlies the formation of sets and sequences in his prints and drawings. Then I will consider the form of spectatorship they elicit, turning to the collectors of prints and drawings and the libraries, discussing the different status between Canaletto's works on paper and other Venetian topographic prints. In conclusion, I will return to discuss the potential of thinking about water as an elemental media, which structures the visual culture of the Veduta. This hypothesis implies that works on paper are particularly suited to produce a sense of movement, virtual movement, thanks to conditions of absorption that existed in the library and in the street shows. The theoretical implications of this argument are twofold. On the one hand, to describe drawing's contribution to the creation of narrative within the tradition of early modern landscape and the development of the Veduta, and on the other, to demonstrate the political import of such narrative sets of images at a time of crisis of the Serenissimi's control on the Mediterranean Sea. In other words, as paradoxical as it may sound, the descriptive, objective Veduta drawings should be placed at the forefront of narrative art. Canaletto discovered the potential of picturing movement through the creation of meaningful sequences in works on paper only after the publishing of the prospectus in the early 1730s and after it obtained a certain success. But thinking in series was normal for painters in the minor genres such as landscape. In Venice and in England, the display of coherent pictorial cycle was normal in the city palaces as well as in the country houses in the mainland. Since the beginning of his independent career as a view painter in the 1720s, Canaletto had received commissions for pictures in sets, which grew to count 24 canvases painted for John Russell in the late 1730s. View paintings usually decorate the upper registers of rooms as overdoors in subgroups created by structural elements such as chimneys or windows. For example, Canaletto's paintings displayed in the dining room at Woburn Abbey decorate the walls by creating a rhythm of alternating groups of smaller and larger size. This photo from a magazine of the 1990s shows just how viewing conditions shape the possibility for the spectator to experience movement through space. Compared to paintings, works on paper imply close-up investigation, invite attentive scrutiny. Besides peep boxes or other viewing machines, which enable the focus on images through the manipulation of light, in the 18th century, libraries or drawing rooms or cabinets were spaces devoted to the close observation of works of paper. More traditional instruments, such as magnifying glasses, were used in this case, as seen in this other scene by Longhi. And another more traditional technology, that of the book, functioned as a viewing machine operated by the spectator who flipped the pages in a given order. Inasmuch as this point may sound banal, it seems crucial to remark the material possibilities of sets of drawings bound in volumes to understand the logic which guided Canaletto's compositional strategies. Let me return for a moment to this important project before we look at the drawings. The prospectus has been traditionally considered as a catalogue of Canaletto's paintings. Because it was ideated and produced by Smith, then the exclusive dealer of the painter's work for clients in Venice and abroad. As I already mentioned, after the first publication in 1735, it was re-edited in 1742, once Smith has established his own publishing firm, run by Giambattista Pasquali, with the addition of 26 views. If we consider the series not just as a response to economic problems, but also to artistic problems, this re-edition becomes significant for its arrangement and material interventions. The traditional interpretation of the prospectus solely as a commercial operation fails to consider not only the print's innovative arrangement, but also the specific interventions at the micro level of the line. The printmaker was again Antonio Visentini, celebrated for his precision in translating painting into the linear language of the print. When in 2002, the late Federico Montecuccoli degli Erri, the authority on 18th century Venetian printmaking, published his comprehensive study on Canaletto's prints, he made an important argument on the artist's personal involvement in the new edition of the prospectus, whose frontispiece bore the expression elegantius recusi. You can see, I hope, in the bottom line of the right image, or more elegantly re-incised. This is the 12th plate of the 1735 edition. As I hope you can see, the clouds are made of parallel lines, straight or curved, and the water surface is composed of pointy graphemes regularly disposed along horizontal lines, contributing to that clear calligraphic language which characterizes this prospectus as a whole. If we compare three versions of the view of the end of the Grand Canal near Santa Clara, so on the left, Visentini's preparatory drawing at the British Museum, in the center, the 1735 edition that we were just looking at, and the 1742 reworking of the same image on the right, it becomes immediately clear that most of the work to make prints more elegant had been done on the water, while the clouds, for instance, had not been retouched. The additional marks render the water surface denser and irregular, while the borders of the shadow reflections on the water becomes blurred. In short, the final aspect of the 1742 edition differentiates more clearly between the elements, particularly water and sky. Montecuccoli argued that Canaletto had a role in reworking the plates along with Visentini because around the same time Canaletto, was correcting the plates of his personal compositions, the 31 etchings entitled Vedute altre prese da luoghi e inviati. The selection of sites from the lagoon and the Venetian mainland near the Grand Canal or Padua may be explained precisely with the fact that Visentini's prospectus was being edited at the same time. If these two projects complement one another in terms of subject matter, they have in common precisely the language of the line. Despite Visentini's aspiration to achieve clarity in the etchings from around 1735, Canaletto's opposite interest in movement emerges with the 1742 corrections. Such reworking occurred at the level of the line, as I said, can be considered as the technical modification which was necessary to emphasize the effect of movement. As the series of the Vedute altre shows, Canaletto's achievement in etching required enormous efforts. The artist uses a number of different utensils to produce broken lines of various qualities, some more calligraphic or pen-like, others more brush-like. By stimulating the imaginative power of the viewer, of the observer, the lines in this capriccio, for example, of the outskirts of Padua, this one, can be described as energetic and with the final effect of movement. In the aquatic view taken on the Brenta Canal near Dolo, the sense of movement is given by boats floating in different directions and the play of reflections on the water surface. The linear language is never formulaic or repetitive, and each segment of the scene receives the same detailing, including the shaded areas in the foreground. Moving on to consider the drawings, the main question concerns the possibility of establishing groups of sheets which can be seen as self-contained series. This is made easier by the fact that the vast majority of Canaletto's 334 surviving drawings, according to the catalogue by Constable and Links, are independent finished works. So the studies for paintings and sketches made on the spot represent an exception within the corpus. In the foreground of his catalogue of the 142 drawings at Windsor, Parker wrote that the artist seems to have worked simultaneously in different styles, the one more pronounced mannerism, the other of less, according to the type of drawing he was engaged upon. Parker also identifies 3 types of drawings corresponding to 3 different pens, quill, reed, and metal, which he usefully associated to the sheets in his catalogue. So, for example, in these 2 sheets of the same subject at Windsor, we have a similar pen work, but one made with quill, the other possibly made with a metal pen. The different tool would explain the distinct quality of the line, the one on the right more liquid than that on the left. Canaletto's low viewpoint is somewhere in front of the Molo, looking up at the imposing facade of the Palazzo Ducale. As all scholars observed, the repetition of this motif, there is a 3rd drawing of the same view currently considered a copy, with slight variations in the figures, boats, and visible portions of the city, in addition to the careful underdrawing in pencil, show that this is not a work, these are not works made on the spot. Among the few groups of drawings which have remained together as a series and which were probably made from nature, maybe with the help of a camera obscura, the so-called Quaderno Cagnola, the only surviving sketchbook depicting the profile of buildings with notations to be used in painting, is a studio object. I also want to mention quickly that recent studies on Canaletto's construction methods carried out at Windsor reveal that he began most of his drawings with pencil and ruler. In this view of the molo with the bucintoro and anchor, freely sketched with horizontal and diagonal scribble hatching, there is a horizon line ruled in pencil and 3 vertical lines dividing the sheet exactly into quarters with ways. These lines do not coincide with any salient features and can hardly have been used to lay out the composition. Yet it does seem likely that the drawing was not made on the spot, but was constructed in the studio from brief sketches and from memory, so that the lines would have worked as a general layout, useful to place the main elements of all similar compositions. To understand my point on Canaletto's logic of the series and the extent to which this approach structured the drawing's composition and use of media, we need to look elsewhere. Both Constable and Lynx and Parker organized their catalogue by subject, since Canaletto rarely took on unique motifs or looked for unconventional locations. Most of the time, we must assume that Canaletto's creation of autonomous drawings of different styles enabled the forming of pairings or sets, which either created a dialectic of opposites or a significant connection. Consider, for example, the fact that many of these drawings adopted the same viewpoint as the prints and paintings of the Grand Canal series. For the dialectic, consider, I'm sorry, this is the wrong slide, but anyway, also the possibility that the more imaginative drawings or capricci became the occasion for discussion about the city's architectural heritage. Where wash is applied to give volume and color to the linear penwork, the result is one of great finish. 2 drawings which Parker considers as pendants because they are enclosed in a ruled ink borderline represent a piazzetta from 2 different sides of the molo. In the foreground of both sheets, the water and the pavement are described through the juxtaposition of pen and wash with strong pictorial effects. Perhaps the best example of this logic is a unique case in Canaletto's oeuvre, the series of 4 large drawings which Parker describes as, I quote, some of the most sensitive and beautiful of Canaletto's drawings. They were certainly made as an end in themselves and from nature, since no replicas, copies, or related pictures are known to exist, end quote. Made on similar sheets about 35 centimeter large, using an economical mix of ink applied with a fine quill pen and a light layer of gray wash and no pinpointing, these views look in different directions from the same area, the Punta di Sant'Antonio. While at the time of Parker's work, the exact location was yet to be recognized, it is now possible to consider these views as another instance of that same topographic logic that we detected in the subgroups from the Grand Canal series. The view of Sant'Elena is the only one where the foreground is entirely occupied by water and boats, while the central position of the galleon in the distant view of the bacino evokes the maritime life of this liminal area situated at the city's outskirts. This unique group of drawings brings us back to Canaletto's interest in water as a structuring element of the views. In fact, although the 4 views just described are not necessarily all seen from the water, they borrow the elongated format used for cityscapes seen from the sea, for example in maritime surveys or geographic atlases, a format which suggests horizontal movement. Canaletto might have combined different visual sources to devise this unusual format. Traditionally, these drawings are associated with etchings by Rembrandt, like the so-called Goldwyer Field, known in Venice thanks to the collection of Rembrandt prints acquired by Anton Maria Zanetti the Elder as early as 1721. In the view of Sant'Elena and La Certosa, and in the view of Castello, two figures sitting on the elevated banks recall the European landscape tradition started in the 16th century, constructed with similar succession of planes and often including shepherds seen from the back. The study of the impact of 16th and 17th century landscape drawings on Canaletto is beyond the scope of this lecture. Nevertheless, I wish to recall the impact that the Venetian collections of prints and drawings would have had on the artist's graphic experiments. In a landscape attributed to Guercino, for example, and I know it's a very damaged drawing, but I hope you can see the same construction of an elevated foreground behind which the gaze can follow some shepherds with their stick, moving towards the vastity of an idyllic panorama. In the first 2 decades of the century, this tradition had been picked up by Marco Ricci, whose drawings, inspired by the Venetian countryside around his native Belluno, would be translated into print just as Canaletto was starting his career as a vedutista. We need to turn our attention to the milieu of collectors instead of the artists, so as to consider more carefully the practices of close observation which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Thanks to published catalogues, manuscript lists, and notary inventories, which became known in the past 20 years or so, we can now compare the libraries of Joseph Smith and Anton Maria Zanetti, the most influential figures in Canaletto's career. Besides collecting, they both dedicated themselves to the promotion of publications. Smith, as already mentioned, through the Pasquali publishing house, and Zanetti through his connections with a network of Italian and international patrons and publishers. In the years around 1744, for example, he supervised a number of printmakers for the production of a series of views of Florence commissioned by the Marchese Andrea Gerini after drawings by Giuseppe Zocchi. Here you see the preparatory drawings for the title pages of those two series, designed by Giuseppe Magni on the left and Giuseppe Zocchi on the right. Smith and Zanetti were both connoisseurs of works on paper, but while the first was foremost a bibliophile, who assembled the most important European collection of incunabula, the other had an antiquarian interest but could not afford to buy statues or paintings due to his bourgeois origins. The content of the libraries, which have been described as museum libraries by Doric Raines because they were made accessible to the public, was listed in printed catalogues or manuscript lists so as to facilitate the visitors. The arrangement of the drawings in volumes and the volumes in cupboards also reflected a new need for accessibility. They were divided by author or subject. A manuscript dated 1744 and only partially published shows that Zanetti's library comprised about 300 items. We find a volume scantily described as containing ornaments and landscape views, which most likely meant both imagined and topographic views, and one volume of prints and drawings by landscape specialist Marco Ricci, in which we see another drawing on the left, who was a close friend of Zanetti's. In this kind of collection, drawings and prints were tightly interconnected so that the scrutiny of the one would illuminate the perception of the other. As a consequence, at times Zanetti did not insist on quality and often acquired proofs as well as rare technical experiments. Already in 1728, in a letter to Gaburi in Florence, Zanetti described his print collection as containing selected sheets by all great masters: Marcantonio, Agostino Veneziano, Bosazone, Albrecht Dürer, Lucas van Leyden, De Carracci, Caillou, French prints from the Imprimerie Royale, as well as those de la Roma Moderna, of modern Rome. Zanetti's library then was assembled primarily with the aim of covering the history of print, with drawings either translated into printed works or used to train the eyes and used as gifts to other connoisseurs. As I already argued, this focus on works of art was in part due to Zanetti's financial situation. At the same time, what we know today of his library must prompt us to move beyond the economic rationale and draw some conclusions on the cultural logic that shaped the collection over the years. By comparison, Smith's library included less albums of old masters and reveals a greater interest for his contemporaries and for geography and topography. The contents of his library varied greatly throughout his life. An extensive catalogue was published in 1755 with the scope of selling it altogether, but was prepared, we know, before 1751. Smith continued to collect also after the acquisition by George III in 1762, and this second collection is recorded in a notary inventory and in the catalogue of the auctions organized after his death in the 1770s. This dynamic evolution is crucial to understand the career of Canaletto and more generally the status of Veduta prints and drawings in Venice. As Anthony Griffiths has demonstrated, from the beginning Smith preferred to buy prints and drawings in albums that were already formed. His collection was a very peculiar and unbalanced print collection. In the same way as the drawings were a mixture of extraordinary strength and complete lacunae. His collecting activities began with an interest in the history of the book and only secondarily in printmaking, so that his acquisitions of drawings and paintings reflected at the beginning his activity as a dealer rather than as a collector. In the manuscript list of his second library, the one formed after the 1762 sale, we find Canaletto's Vedute Altre, for example, but no drawings at all by Canaletto or others. Geography and topography, however, seems to have gained a certain appeal for Smith. While Zanetti owned only one geographic atlas, published by Albrizzi in 1740, Smith seems to have collected all important compendia of topographic views and geographic atlases published in early modern Europe. Within the same group as Canaletto's drawings, for example, Smith stored various atlases by Johann Blau, Ortelius' Triantrum Orbis Terrarum, albums of views of London. There we also find the volumes of views of Venice, published in the first half of the 18th century, by Luca Carlevaris, by Domenico Lovisa, and by Vincenzo Coronelli. Noticeably, Smith's inventories do not list the publication of Michele Marieschi's views, published in 1741, which was a direct competitor of the prospectus. None of this series was conceived according to topographic logic. The views were usually arranged in order of symbolic cultural significance, with the Basilica of San Marco usually opening the series. This depended largely on the publication's political agenda. For example, Carlevaris and Coronelli were both employed by the Serenissima as instructor of mathematics or engineer the first and cartographer the second. Lovisa was not a painter, but a publisher and engraver who produced many illustrated books in his career, and his views of Venice never really received much attention, given the success of Canaletto and Marieschi's publication only after a few years later. Marieschi, who died prematurely, never became as successful as other view painters, despite Zanetti's support of him within his network of patrons. Compared to them, Canaletto was the only artist who embraced the potential of the series to devise a topographically significant itinerary. This may seem strange, since despite all differences, collectors like Smith and Zanetti mostly gathered albums and collected works in already formed series. But this anomaly can be explained with the practice of selling loose sheets to clients who would then compose their volumes or frame them for display. The flourishing of the bookbinding trade in Venice, which was obviously separated from that of publishing, encouraged the careful organization of printed sets according to the collector's will. In the early decades of the 18th century, the manipulation of volumes and the attentive observation enabled by the technology of the book remained confined towards the small international circle to which Zanetti and Smith belonged. In my talk, Canaletto emerges as an intelligent and highly original artist, and yet he has traditionally enjoyed a reputation of catering to conventional taste for urban landscape, from the first British aristocrats who acquired his views as souvenirs of the Grand Tour, to the modern collectors who conform to a bourgeois preference for the decadent aesthetics of nostalgia conveyed by his rendering of Venice, such as this one. One is struck by the fact that despite the continuing attention art historians pay to the artist in the form of exhibitions as well as catalogue raisonné, and we are waiting for the new catalogue of his drawings by Anna Bożena-Kowalczyk, few have tried to save the artist from the process of over-aestheticization. Given the philosophical depth uncovered in the artist's contemporary compatriots, such as Giambattista Tiepolo by Svetlana Alpes and Michael Baxandal, and our present interest in the relation between architectural heritage, environment, and ecology, the evident core of Canaletto's work, one wishes that the possibility exists that his oeuvre is recognized for possessing some theoretical depth and unprecedented imaginative power, and even political engagement. Yet critical attention to the artist remains in the main focused on the beauty, technical mastery, and socio-economic value of his exquisite rendering of Venice, or his inventive capricci of the lagoon. In conclusion, I wish to secure the association between what I have called the visual culture of spectacle and the structuring power of water. By focusing on Canaletto's works on paper, one is encouraged to observe that the artist took water as a guiding principle. Recent art historical studies on the liquid intelligence of early modern painters provide fruitful references. Whether they argue that Claude Lorrain's paintings are structured around a duality between dry and liquid, or that Turner's Sublime is mainly represented in the form of sea storms and evokes the phenomenological experience of drowning. In the Venetian context, Stefan Nauner has connected the visual reading of Carpaccio's pictorial cycles to instructions for navigation in Venetian literature, while Roland Christian suggested that both Titian and Tintoretto composed their pictures by calculating the gradual appearance, as if they unraveled following bodily movement. Likewise, Alpers and Baxandal write that Tiepolo's pictorial intelligence, I quote, postulate a mobile light and a mobile viewer, and take into account the freakish intermittent effect of moving water reflecting off the ceiling designs painted quickly into wet plaster intonaco, for example, at the Church of the Gesuati at the Zattere. And this is the best photo of that sense of light coming in from the water that I could find. This spectacular scenographic conception of image composition corresponded to a similar approach to urban design. In the 16th century, the Republic of Venice devised what Daniel Savoy describes as a series of water-oriented urbanistic practices to shape the visual and metaphoric image of the city, from the open waterways of the lagoon to the narrow canals of the island proper. Andrea Palladio, for example, was aware of this when he was working on the design of the churches of San Giorgio and the Redentore in the Bay of San Marco, for which he seems to have refined a pre-existing local practice that harnessed the kinetic properties of water. And this is what I hope you can see on the left, with the main Palladian church is orientated to the center of the San Marco Bay. The visual force of the bay in front of San Marco has been enhanced through thoughtful planning for the benefit of those who move on a boat. And I wish to point out that when Canaletto draws the water basin in front of the Molo, the viewpoint is always from the Giudecca, which would have been the entry point in most, let's say, celebration and urban festivities. And so urban design invites this particular lateral gaze. In this sense, Canaletto, like other artists before him, was aware that movement through water granted the spectator an uninterrupted visual engagement with the urban setting, freed from peripheral distractions and from the somatic self-awareness of walking. This sensitivity also complies with the artist's background in theatre set design. Although Zanetti the Younger wrote in the artist's biography that he had quit theatre upon his return from Rome in the early 1720s, his theatrical imagination remained visible throughout his career, making it possible to use a cinematic metaphor. Canaletto's series imply a process of cognitive montage on the part of the beholder, whereby the passage from one view to the next defines the experience of space. This process amounts to a work of emotional recomposition of sequences, which was well known to Baroque stage designers. As a motif capable of suggesting motion, water is not just an infrastructure, a route, a resource, but also a medium by which movement was enabled to be represented in Venetian art. The peculiar condition of Venice as a city built on water in the middle to its mainland by a network of rivers and canals. The drawings of views of the Grand Canal and those of the lagoon, its islands and coastline, shows the different ways in which Canaletto constructed spatial meaning and composed the sequences to create this sense of movement. While the first group comprises the drawings that verge towards the topographic, the second conveys the creative freedom afforded by travels in the countryside. Yet both employ the devices that produce the impression of being surrounded by moving water. At a time when the territorial perception in Venice had to confront the decline of the Serenissima as a Mediterranean empire, the Venetian visual culture began to pay more attention to the stato da terra than to the stato da mare. The lagoon and mainland areas were suddenly represented as an extension of this sea, Mediterranean Sea, into the land. This point is crucial. Art historiography traditionally considers the Veduta as a result of the discovery of mechanized optical systems, emphasizing the recurring subjects, events, and landmarks which attracted European tourists. These accounts tend to set aside the theatricality of Venetian culture in favor of the connection with Enlightenment science and new scientific collecting practices. But the culture of spectacle actually eliminated differences between high and low art forms in the same way in which it required everyone to wear masks in order to blend social classes. It had a strong political connotation. In the famous dialogue Il Newtonianismo per le Dame, published in 1737, Francesco Algarotti echoes a traditional 16th century argument associating the effects of the camera obscura to paintings. He talks about the paintings of Canaletto in which a ship sails from one side to the other and the sun variously dances on the broken waves. This passage designates the camera obscura as one of the most beautiful shows, spettacoli, that can never be invented. Indeed, the vedute never aimed at objective representations of the world, but produced spectacular effects using pictorial devices such as the arrangement in series. And in fact, the prototypes used in the Mondo Nuovo, like those that we've seen, was instrumental in bringing popular forms of visuality closer to the more elevated idioms of landscape prints and drawings. At the same time as it produced the phenomenological experience of movement, Canaletto's graphic oeuvre participated in the renovation of the image of urban life according to new territorial narrations. Thank you very much.